This is the Bible Book Club. I'm Susan.
And I'm Heather.
And we're in the book of 2 Samuel.
Welcome to the club. Last episode in 2 Samuel chapters 14 and 15, the chain of events led to David's forced evacuation of Jerusalem. Joab began the chain by interfering in David's life. He thought it would be best if Absalom returned as heir to the crown. David didn't want this, so Joab tricked him into it. Joab hired a wise woman to tell the story of a son who murdered another. David then pardoned the murderer and was then forced to pardon also his own son. Absalom returned and began his campaign for king. After 4 years, he planned a coup in Hebron and was successful. David had to run for his life for the second time in his life.
Exactly. Okay, so I want to talk about this. I want us to not miss the author's focus on relationships in these last few chapters. Remember, this is the king with a heart for the Lord, but his heart also gets him in a little trouble.
Yeah, he's called a man after God's own heart,
right?
But he's not perfect.
He's not perfect because he has this compassionate heart that then kind of leads to these bad relationships. David's sin is in his relationships with Bathsheba and with his children. And therefore, his consequences are relational also. In the last chapter, Joab interfered in David's relationship by bringing Absalom back. Then Absalom rebelled first against Joab and then against David. Again, it was a relational thing. The Kerethites, Pelethites, and Gittites, all foreigners, are loyal to David. Zadok, the priest, is loyal. Ahithophel is not loyal. Hushai is loyal. These are all people that either reject or embrace their relationship with David. With every step in his exodus from Jerusalem, David is confronted by people who have chosen to be for or against him. It must have been an emotional roller coaster for a man with such a tender heart. To be accepted would be such a relief. To be rejected would be so much pain. David is still on the roller coaster in this episode. He is still on his emotional exodus from Jerusalem. He is still at risk of being caught and killed by his son Absalom. With every step on the journey and with every person he meets, David is forced to face the fact that this is war. And in a war of kings, only the winner gets to live. Scene 1. Ziba is loyal to David.
Chapter 16. When David had gone a short distance beyond the summit, there was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth, waiting to meet him. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine. The king asked Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" And Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on. The bread and fruit are for the men to eat, and the wine is to refresh those who become exhausted in the wilderness." The king then asked, "Where is your master's grandson?" Ziba said to him, "He is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks today the Israelites will restore to me my grandfather's kingdom." Then the king said to Ziba, "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." "I humbly bow," Ziba said. "May I find favor in your eyes, my lord the king."
Well, we last met Ziba in chapter 9. Ziba was the steward of Saul. David made him responsible for Mephibosheth, the lame son of Jonathan. Now, Ziba has brought David provisions demonstrating his support, which so reminded me of Abigail. I can't help it. Ziba informs David that the gifts are not from Mephibosheth because Mephibosheth is hoping to benefit from the coup.
Which for David had to be a big slap in the face, back to what you were just talking about. Some of the people supported him and some didn't, because he only allowed Mephibosheth to live because of his promise to Jonathan, who was his best friend.
Right. So you feel this kind of joy for Ziba bringing him these gifts, but then pain thinking Mephibosheth has rejected him. Well, the information, though, does not sound like the Mephibosheth that we know. And in chapter 19, Mephibosheth denies it. David believes Ziba and gives Mephibosheth's land to Ziba in return for his support for now. That may change if you're on team Mephibosheth like I am. Okay, scene 2. Shimei curses David.
Verse 5, as King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gerah, and he cursed as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose palace you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a murderer. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. But the king said, what does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, then who can ask, why do you do this? David then said to Abishai and to the officials, my son, my own flesh and blood is trying to kill me. How much more then this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore me his covenant blessing instead of his curse today. So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went, and throwing stones at him, and showering him with dirt. The king and all the people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself.
So this is kind of an interesting scene. Shimei curses David because Shimei is a Benjaminite. Shimei is loyal to the house of Saul and blames David for the murder of those in Saul's army who would have all been Benjaminites. David knows that this was not his real sin, for he never touched a hair on Saul's head. He did not kill Saul. And he even did his best to avoid war with Saul, so he can't even be responsible for all those Benjaminites. But David is convicted because of Shimei's words. Shimei said, you have come to ruin because you are a murderer. And these words were true to David. David had murdered Uriah, and now he is living the consequences. In Shimei's curse, David hears Nathan's words of prophecy,
which said this, you struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house because you have despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own.
David's acceptance of Shimei's curses is remarkable. His guards want to silence Shimei permanently and could have easily done so. They were on his right and on his left. Yet David rightly sees Shimei's words as just another sign on the road pointing to his own guilt, and he accepts it as a word from the Lord. Despite the public humiliation and private hurt, David is loyal to God, and his loyalty requires a massive reservoir of restraint because he could fight back. He could murder Shimei on the spot, but David has learned his lesson from Bathsheba. He cannot ever give in to what he wants because the consequences affect everyone. He must wait for the Lord, who will have mercy on him, a sinner, if it is God's will. So note to us, this is a huge lesson. Our sin affects others. When we count the cost of our consequences, we must count the cost to others. In other words, think twice before you sin, because the consequences have twice the cost. Well, Psalm 3 is titled, A Psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. And we know David loves to write songs or psalms when he is in deep trouble. Listen to verse 2 and 3 and picture David climbing that Mount of Olives. Then picture our Savior Jesus and how David's words accurately reflect what Jesus too may have been experiencing in the exact same location.
Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear, though tens of thousands assail me on every side. Arise, Lord, deliver me, my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw. Break the teeth of the wicked. From the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessing be on your people.
David knew what Jesus knew, what we must come to believe. From the Lord comes deliverance.
I also think it's a really good example of how we can respond in a situation where cancel culture is activated, because cancel culture is kind of like all the people saying, hey, cancel that person, he's done wrong. And some of the things that Shimei was saying were true and some weren't. He was a murderer, but it wasn't. He didn't defend himself. David didn't. Mm-mm. He just continued on, allowed the insults to be hurled just like Jesus. He just continued on. He didn't say, no, it's not true. Allowed the insults to happen, because if you're following the Lord and you know that what you're doing is what he's called you to do, then you forge on and the truth will eventually come.
And you don't have to worry about other people.
Yeah.
All right, scene 3, back to Absalom in Jerusalem, where David planted Hushai as a spy for him.
Verse 15, meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Then Hushai the Archite, David's confidant, went to Absalom and said to him, long live the king, long live the king. Absalom said to Hushai, so this is the love you show your friend? If he's your friend, why didn't you go with him? Hushai said to Absalom, no, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel, his I will be, and I will remain with him. Furthermore, whom shall I serve? Should I not serve the son? Just as I served your father, so I will serve you.
Hushai is so clever. I love him. I don't know why. I just love him. So Absalom arrives in Jerusalem with Ahithophel, David's former wise and respected advisor, and they're greeted by Hushai, who hails them with, long live the king, long live the king. However, he never specifies which king, David or Absalom. Hushai is a master at hiding his true thoughts. Now, Absalom is still a little suspicious and questions him further. His question, though, is rather ironic. He says, so this is the love you show your friend? Now, the word love used here is translated as hesed, which we know is an act of kindness for a person in desperate need and with whom you have an enduring relationship. The irony is that it is Absalom who is the one who should be questioned. So this is the love you show your father? Because his father is in desperate need because of him, and he is in the relationship where he should be showing hesed, kindness, love. Now, Hushai dances around the topic with great diplomacy and wins a spot in Absalom's circle as the spy that David needs.
Verse 20. Absalom said to Ahithophel, give us your advice. What should we do? Ahithophel answered, sleep with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be more resolute. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now, in those days, the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice.
So we had this problem with Abner, remember? So let me explain. First, Absalom seeks advice first from Ahithophel about what to do next. And without question, Absalom follows it because of Ahithophel's reputation as a man whose word seems like God's words. Ahithophel has the big reputation. When David left Jerusalem, remember, he left behind 10 concubines to take care of the palace. Absalom slept with them on the roof so that all of Israel could see. Why? Because in so doing, Absalom was sending a message. Royal women, whether wives or concubines, played a political role in forging alliances as gifts and as objects to claim when dethroning a king. So foreigners or other kings would give their daughters as concubines or as wives, and it forged relationships. And so when a king came in, If he slept with them, that meant he was taking over control. So by sleeping with them, Absalom was claiming to be king. It was one thing to take over the palace. It was quite another to claim and possess the king's women on top of the palace for all of Israel to see. They pitched a tent on top of the palace.
It seems really disrespectful and kind of depraved.
Very. Absalom has now irreversibly broken with his father. There is no turning back. Absalom has also fulfilled Nathan's words to David in 2 Samuel chapter 12.
Verse 11, this is what the Lord says, out of your own household, I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel.
What David did in secret, taking Uriah's wife, Absalom did publicly to David. Scene 4, Ahithophel versus Hushai. With the concubine claim completed, Absalom is ready for more wisdom from Ahithophel.
Chapter 17. Ahithophel said to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he is weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed. This plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel.
Ahithophel was indeed wise. Striking while David was weak and on the run was exactly the right move. But on David's exodus from Jerusalem, when he had learned of Ahithophel's betrayal, he had prayed, Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. And God is faithful.
Verse 5, but Absalom said, summon also Hushai the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say as well. When Hushai came to him, Absalom said, Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion. Hushai replied to Absalom, the advice Ahithophel has given is not good this time. You know your father and his men, they are fighters and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with troops. Even now, he is hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, there has been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom. Then even the bravest soldier whose heart is like the heart of a lion will melt with fear, for all Israel knows that your father is a fighter and that those with him are brave. So I advise you, let all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws into the city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it down to the valley until not so much as a pebble is left. Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel, for the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom.
Hushai paints this huge picture of Israel's victory, and he's very persuasive, and his advice is backed by historical truth. David's record as the victor of wars is legendary, but it is really God who wins the day by using Hushai to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel and to buy David the time he needs. Scene 5. Hushai warns David. Now, Hushai does not waste a minute of the precious time God has given to them. He immediately turns to the other resident spies, the priests, remember Zadok, who apparently are running an intelligence ring to get David the message that he must cross over the Jordan and prepare for battle.
Verse 15, Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar the priests, Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such, but I have advised them to do so and so. Now send a message at once and tell David, do not spend the night at the fords in the wilderness. Cross over without fail, or the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up. Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying at En-Rogel. A female servant was to go and inform them, and they were to go to tell King David, for they could not risk being seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So the two of them left at once and went to the house of a man in Bahurim. He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. His wife took a covering and spread it out over the opening of the well and scattered grain over it. No one knew anything about it. When Absalom's men came to the woman at the house, they asked, where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? The woman answered, they crossed over the brook. The men searched, but found no one. So they returned to Jerusalem. After they had gone, the two climbed out of the well and went to inform King David. They said to him, set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you. So David and all the people with him set out and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan.
So Hushai gets to Zadok, but before the female servant gets to Jonathan and Ahimaaz with the message, Absalom hears of it. Now remember, Ahimaaz and Jonathan are the sons of the priests Zadok and Abiathar. The woman hides Jonathan and Ahimaaz, and they then escape and carry the message to David.
Verse 23, when Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb.
Okay, that seems random.
Didn't see that one
random.
coming.
Yeah, really random. Ahithophel's suicide appears foolish and hasty and totally unlike the wise advisor that he is. And we can only guess why. Most theories in the commentaries liken Ahithophel to Judas. Ahithophel was shrewd. He knew his advice was the right move. And when it failed, when they took Hushai's instead, he knew that he was on the wrong side. Ahithophel's eyes were opened and he was deeply convicted. He had rebelled against David, God's anointed king. And in so doing, he had rebelled against God, and he was not going to win. He could see that Absalom was not going to win. So like Judas, he could not face the consequences. And like Judas, he hung himself.
That's a Bible bender for me, is the parallel between those two in that same place.
Yeah. Judas was really close to Jesus. And Ahithophel was really close to David and betrayed him. Both of them betrayed the person that they knew to be closest to God. And faced with that, when their eyes were opened, I think it overwhelmed them. Yeah. They didn't want to face what was coming, which then makes you respect David all the more because he did face his consequences and took them just with grace and humility. Mm. All right, scene 6. David finds friends in the Transjordan.
Verse 24, David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Amasa was the son of Jether, an Ishmaelite who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, and sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. The Israelites and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobai, son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir, son of Amiel from Lo-Dabar, and Berzali, the Gileadite from Rogalim, brought bedding and bowls and articles of pottery. They also brought wheat and barley, flour and roasted grain, beans and lentils, honey and curds, sheep, and cheese from cow's milk for David and his people to eat. For they said, the people have become exhausted and hungry and thirsty in the wilderness.
Hushai's delay gave David enough time to reach Mahanaim before Absalom crossed the Jordan in pursuit. Now, Amasa, Absalom's army commander, is a distant relative, maybe a second cousin, of Joab, who is the commander of David's army. I point that out because everyone is somehow related in Israel. It's a family feud, is what it is. Now, the city of Mahanaim is a haven physically and emotionally for David. And I think the author makes that point of that even though David's journey out of Jerusalem was rough, he gets this kind of like manna along the way. He receives unexpected support from Shobi, an Ammonite, and the Ammonites are enemies of Israel, Machir from Lo-Debar, which is where Mephibosheth had been living, and Barzillai, a Gileadite from a clan of Israel. So their support must have been encouraging to David, and the supplies just so nourishing and felt like, God providing for them along the way. Scene 7, David battles on. It is estimated, so picture this scene, because we're not talking about David and Goliath here. We're talking about a much older David. It is estimated that David is about in his early 60s at this time. It's also estimated that by this time he had won over 60 battles in his lifetime. And while David's accomplishments appear glorious, the reality is that David's life was not glorious. He has lived, think about it, 60 battles under intense pressure, physical hardship, camping out in caves, and living with grief that was never far from him, even in his senior years. None of David's victories, the dynasty or the crown, were enviable. They were bloody and layered with death. There was only one thing to envy about David, and that was his heart. It still, even now, beats for God. No matter how hard he had fallen, his heart turned back to God always. And because of that, God gives him another victory.
Chapter 18. David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David sent out his troops, a third under the command of Joab, a third under Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and a third under Ittai the Gittite. The king told the troops, I myself will surely march out with you. But the men said, you must not go out. If we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care. But you are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better now for you to give us support from the city. The king answered, I will do whatever seems best to you. So the king stood beside the gate while all his men marched out in units of hundreds and of thousands. The king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders.
As a parent, I cringe in this moment. David is urged to stay back for good reason. It is him that Absalom is after. In a war of kings, one must die. And you could hear, normally David would never hang back. Mm-hmm. He was always with his men. But in this case, he knows, if I face my son, I have to make a choice. Let him kill me or I have to kill him. And David does something very unusual. He hangs back because he doesn't want to make that decision. And he even calls after and commands them, hey guys, be gentle with him for my sake. But they all know that's just not reality.
Do you think he wouldn't have been able to do it and he knows that?
Oh, absolutely. David commands the entire army to be gentle, which clearly means to not kill Absalom or hurt him too badly. It was an unrealistic request, and he knows that.
Verse 6, David's army marched out of the city to fight Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. There, Israel's troops were routed by David's men, and the casualties that day were great, 20,000 men. The battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest swallowed up more men that day than the sword. Now, Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and his mule went under the thick branches of a large oak. Absalom's hair got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in midair while the mule he was riding kept on going.
Okay, you know I have a thing about donkey humor.
This donkey's not going to start talking, don't worry.
We have covered it. And I think here we are in this serious story and we have a donkey story. God likes donkey humor. In Numbers 22, we had Balaam and the talking donkey. Then we had Saul chasing donkeys in 1 Samuel 9, which was a foreshadowing of his spiritual journey. It was basically Saul was chasing donkeys. Here, Absalom is on a donkey or a mule, which technically is a half-breed donkey. In any case, donkeys or mules were ridden by kings or princes. Remember, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. The irony is that Absalom lost his seat on his royal donkey, and he was about to lose his seat in the scene on the royal throne. So it is such a picture of what happens to him. Like he gets swept off his donkey, he's trying to act royal on this donkey and he gets pulled off because God's about to pull him from the throne. There's also some absurd humor in the fact that Absalom was famous for weighing his luxurious hair for all to see. And now his vanity has caught him up in the air for all to see, he's suspended by his luxurious hair. Like God is making such a fool of him, which of course, again, then reminded me of Samson, another man whose life was tangled up in his hair. Yep. A little bit of humor in the middle of this tragedy.
God invented a sense of humor.
He invented
it.
He and the angels just thought this whole scene was getting too serious. And so they injected the donkey.
Continuing in verse 10. When one of the men saw what had happened, he told Joab, I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. Joab said to the man who had told him this, What? You saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? Then I would have had to give you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt. But the man replied, Even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out into my hands, I would not lay a hand on the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai protect the young man Absalom for my sake. And if I put my life in jeopardy and nothing is hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me. Joab said, I'm not going to wait like this for you. So he took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him.
So one of the men sees Absalom hanging and tells Joab. Now, this man is very faithful. He heard what David said, and so he doesn't kill Absalom himself.
Faithful and smart, because he knows that not only am I faithful, but I am smart enough to know you guys would just throw me under the bus.
Totally. Joab chastises, yells at the man who, in obedience to David, did not kill Absalom. Joab, again, does what he wants. And this is, again, like I've said, Joab, love him, hate him. He's good and he's bad. In our last episode, Joab interfered and tricked David into agreeing to let Absalom move back to Jerusalem. That hasn't worked out well for David or Joab. All Joab's fault. My guess is that Joab knew that David could not kill his traitor son. And Joab is over Absalom. David was too soft when it came to his kids. He knows this, and Joab was not going to take any chances. He is going to send a message to all of David's other sons that you will die if you try to kill the king. Joab does what he wants. And that's just the point. Joab wants to do what he wants if he thinks it's right. He's really not loyal to God. He's loyal to David, but he thinks he knows what's right for David. So sometimes when David looks a little weak and wishy-washy, Joab just takes control, which I love that Joab's so loyal to David. I don't love that he doesn't have a heart for the Lord. Joab disobeys his king and he kills his king's son. Absalom's obsession with power comes to a brutal end.
Verse 16. Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped pursuing Israel, for Joab halted them. They took Absalom, threw him into a big pit in the forest, and piled a large heap of rocks over him. Meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes. During his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to himself, for he thought, I have no son to carry on the memory of my name. He named the pillar after himself, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day.
Absalom is routed, his followers flee, and his legacy is over because apparently, remember, he had 3 sons and a daughter he named Tamar. His sons were never named, so apparently they probably died as children or infants, and therefore he doesn't have a legacy to carry on. Well, David scored another glorious victory, but was it? David will mourn for his would-be assassin Absalom, just as he mourned for his other would-be assassin Saul, but probably more. Grief was never far from David, especially now. And while his heart still beats for the Lord, it breaks for his son.
What's a club without friends? If you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you can say, Welcome to the club. New episodes drop every Monday, and get all episodes now on Amazon Music. As always, head over to susanme.com/Bible Book Club for show notes from today's episode. Bible Book Club is hosted by Susan Merrill and Heather Rubio, edited by Buck Buchanan, produced by Haley Mawat.